Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this panel discussion on building blocks for European AI as part of the European AI Policy Conference. My name is Daniel Castro, and I'm director of the Center for Data Innovation. Before we begin, I want to remind you that, remind our audience that you can ask questions of the panelists using the chat on the right side of your screen, and we'll be taking your questions at the end of the panel. On this panel, we're exploring what the EU needs to be successful in AI, including areas like skills, research, and data. Last year, the Center for Data Innovation published a report, which is available on our website, assessing how the EU compares to China and the United States. And while the report goes into significant detail, I'd say that we really came away with two main findings. First, for the EU, it lags other countries in terms of data availability. In particular, China, partially because of a lack of coordination among member states for some of the public sector data. And second, the EU struggles to convert its very large research base to successful commercial enterprises. We're going to be releasing an update to that report very soon, but for now, we really want to focus on this important question of how do we develop a healthy AI ecosystem in Europe? So to discuss this question, I'm really delighted to welcome this expert panel with us today. We have Robert Dim, attaché with the Information Society and Telecommunications with the permanent representation of Germany to the EU. We have Martin Ulbrich, senior expert with DG Connect at the European Commission. Aurélie Coulier, senior lead for EU Public Affairs with Zalando. Peter Lockbiller, director of public affairs with Booking.com. And Fernando Viegas, senior AI researcher and co-lead of Google's People and AI Research Initiative. So thanks to everyone for being here today. To start off, Martin, let me go to you. What do you see as Europe's key strengths when it comes to AI?
Well, one of them I think you mentioned already. That's the fact that Europe has been traditionally very strong in AI, in the research, I mean. Partly because we have been funding research throughout the times when AI wasn't very popular, what is generally referred to as the AI winter. And the European program was one of the main sources of funding at that time. So that's a kind of historical reason why we are very strong. Of course, one of the areas, one of the big contrasts between Europe and the United States, I think, and also partly China, is that Europe is much stronger in industrial data. I think it's generally acknowledged that we're fairly weak, Europe as a whole is fairly weak in consumer data. Mostly because the big platforms are either from the US or China, and therefore European companies don't really have much access to that. But Europe does have a lot of industrial data, and it has a lot of potential in that area. Among the other areas which I would like to quote, I mean, the most famous is robotics. Europe is still world leading in robotics. And sometimes it's just like the small details which give you an idea. It's like recently I came across, I was in a meeting and somebody told me, which I didn't know, that something like 85% of milking robots are made in Europe. So there are lots of little niches where Europe is fairly strong. And then in going forward, I think there's a huge potential for Europe in neuromorphic solutions. And also very, very strong, of course, because of our very heavy policy focus on green, is the low power, low energy consumption systems. So these are the areas where Europe is probably strong right now and can build upon them. But of course, I mean, we have to acknowledge that there are plenty of other areas where Europe is, I wouldn't say very weak, but it's challenged. Let's put it that way.
Thanks. I want to open it up to the full panel for this question as well. Maybe Robert next, and anyone else who wants to jump in, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, hello to everyone first, and thanks for inviting me to this panel. It's our presidency is coming closely to the end now, and I want to use this opportunity to also report a bit what we did on AI or on the topics that you have mentioned under our presidency. But to the substance, I think you mentioned a very relevant thing, the availability of data. I mean, AI goes together with data. You can probably not separate the two issues. And if I were someone who wanted to found a startup company, I would build upon, like, for example, a data set that is interesting, that allows me to develop kind of a software upon it, and to make a business out of it. And I don't know. I think in some areas we're pretty good when it comes to data. I think some research data, or I don't know, in Europe, the availability is really, really good already. Also, public sector data, I think we are very well advanced in the open data movement, let's say, and things are even getting better. There is a legal act on very important data sets coming up. We did the PSI recast 2 years ago, roughly. So things are really in development. And now, very recently, the Commission put on the table a new proposal on the Data Governance Act that also aims at making data more easily accessible. But on the other hand, I think we also have still a problem there. And you mentioned it, basically, that this is like the key factor maybe for AI. And this question, I would hope that it's also a bit answered by the industry representatives today, what they see as the challenging issues around data in Europe, why it's maybe not so easy to get the data in Europe that they need for developing their products. I would be very interested in your view there. But from our side, I think the problem is well known, and really the steps are already, or have been begun to been taken. And there is more to come. I mean, the Commission really has a quite fully fledged strategy with different building blocks, starting now from this DGA, and not to mention the Digital Market Act that's also kind of about data, and then Data Act. So we are very, very committed here to work together with the Commission on the realization of the data strategy. On the other hand, we really need to make sure that we tackle the real problems that there are, and that we don't create kind of new problems with initiatives coming from the legislator, for example.
Thanks for that. Aurélie and maybe Peter, I think that next naturally goes to you. Two successful European technology companies, what are the data needs that you have in this space?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment first. Indeed, you may know Zalando as the fashion and beauty online platform. We are mostly a tech company. So if you look at our employees in headquarters in Berlin, 2,000 are tech, so engineers, or data scientists, or AI researchers, and this is 2,000 out of 6,000, so it's a pretty big share. My comment would actually be less on data, but rather on digitalization. So we really see this as one of the building blocks. It all starts with data, but in a digital format. And of course, it's easier for e-commerce companies by nature. The data will be digital. And hence, there's an advantage in the start. But for companies that don't have data in this digital format, they first need to digitalize. And it can be good for them outside of doing AI. Digitalization has benefits, but this is the first step to even think of AI. From our business perspective, it's also, AI is a necessary investment. It has to be done. It's hugely important and it's strategic. So there is no question there. I mean, to give you one example, if you on Zalando at any given point you'll find 600,000 products. So this is way too much for any customer to go through. It's possible, but you'd have to be very, very determined, and it's rather obvious that to give personalized recommendation, AI is necessary, and this is also the future. So the future competing factor is on this personalization. It's true for our online fashion market, but it's true for many other actors. So this is perhaps the first two comments I can make first.
Thanks for that. And, certainly coming after, the typical Black Friday holiday shopping season, we were particularly glad you were able to make time for us, because I'm sure your platform's been quite busy, and I'm sure you've been busy as well. Peter, let's go to you.
Yeah, happy to come in, and just wanted to start by saying that I'm happy that we, start this panel talking about opportunities and strengths in Europe. We often have a tendency in Europe maybe to talk too much about shortcomings, which exist. I don't want to deny them in any way. It's no secret that Europe is lagging behind in many ways, but nice to start on the strengths. And three areas that I'd like to mention there. The first one is more an opportunity than a strength, but it's the fact that we are starting to look at pooling resources, both on the investment and research side, but also on the regulatory side, where I'd like to really congratulate the European Commission on the vision of looking at AI, looking into the future, not looking backwards or things that we have missed out when it comes to the digital single market, which took way too long, and as we know, it's still not fully completed. So not trying to change the past, but looking into the future, how Europe can play a shaping role there. So that's great to see. My second point then is to indeed look at what we have in Europe. You have two European-born companies on the panel here today with Zalando and Booking, and both of them with heavy investments in machine learning and AI. Booking is one of the top 10 investors to our counting in any way in Europe to invest in the technology, which is increasingly core to pretty much anything we do, core to the customer experience, to the products, to the services. So there is a lot that exists in Europe, and yes, with a particular strength in B2B, but not to forget about B2C that we also have. And then my third point would be about European strength, that I do believe that values-based ethical AI is the future. I think there will be no AI in a sustainable long-term perspective if it is not in line with values and ethics. And if you look at the state of the world, I would argue we have a strength here in Europe that we can build upon, and hopefully with a strong transatlantic renaissance, if you want, with opportunities to collaborate on the regulatory side.
Thank you for that. I want to stay on this topic of European strengths, and I'll open this up to whoever wants to take the first question. And the question here is, to what extent are these strengths that we see in Europe found equally across all EU member states? Because I think this often gets into the politics of AI, where there's sometimes concern that there's concern that there's maybe more concentration of AI expertise or AI companies outside of Europe. But I'm also wondering internally, how, where do the strengths lie, and are they spread equally?
I mean, if you want, I can start. I think that's really one of the greatest things that you have here in the EU, like the diversity that we have. And I mean, it can also be a weakness, of course. I mean, when you look at the budget negotiations, it took quite long, and we're still not there to fix the MFF, and this is all burdensome and so on. But on the other hand, we should really make use of this diversity. And I don't know if the strengths are really equally distributed. And I think that's also not kind of a purpose or an aim that we should look for. I mean, I think it's it's more the diversity that we have that we should use as an opportunity to also learn from each other. One example is the Estonians. They are absolutely great in setting their public services up by using digital technologies. They are really front runners here. And I think countries like Germany can learn a lot from them here. You know, they have maybe more kind of a startup mentality here that brings them to a very pragmatic approach in a way. I hope I don't insult anyone here, but in Germany things take usually a bit longer, and we have to like scrutinize everything from top to bottom. But I mean, if you put both together, you can learn a lot from each other. And the same is true in almost any area. If you look, for example, at Romania, you have great, very skilled people there that build quite an industry around cyber security and so on. So that gives you a lot of opportunity to get this kind of startup spirit that you have. And then Martin, he already mentioned like the industrial backbone that we still have in Europe with all the data, all the companies. So I think this kind of diversity, it's actually a great asset that we have. Still, I think we should thrive for like a perfection of the single market to make really the exchange easier. But yeah, in my optimism, I would say we shouldn't like aim for like an equal distribution or anything. I think we should let things grow in a way and really try to learn from each other and make the best out of it.
Thanks, Fernanda. I think you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, I have some thoughts on this as well. I am not European. I came here very recently. I asked to come here to Europe, actually, and Google is investing even more in Europe because we see a lot of the strengths here. There are, and as a researcher, some of the things that are most dear to me in terms of European strengths in AI are definitely the thriving developer community that you have here and the world-class universities. And so some of the cutting edge technology that comes out of academia comes out of Europe. Some of the best researchers in the world are in Europe. And as has already been mentioned in this panel, you are at the forefront of AI policy and governance. You are leading the way there. And so there's a lot that the rest of the world can learn from what's happening in Europe. I think Europe has a leadership role to play. And also the other thing that's becoming very clear is that, you know, people think about ethical AI, questions around things like bias and fairness and so forth, transparency, accountability. And these tend to fall under the rubric of responsible AI. And the truth is, responsible AI is becoming a competitive advantage because guess what? Being transparent, having accountability, having a way to explain what your model is doing, how it's behaving, and what the limitations might be, is actually really important, not only for the people building these systems, so they can build better systems, but also for the consumers who are on the receiving end of these systems, right? And so these things, even though in the beginning people may have thought, oh, you know, now we have to stop and think about all these other considerations around explainability. Now it's very clear. Everybody's on the same page because these things are needed both from the side of who's building the technology and also from the side of who's using the technology. So it's all around an important area, both of research and in terms of businesses as well, and obviously governance.
So I want to stay on this question of ethical AI that Fernanda talked about and Peter also brought up. We see this come up a lot in the discussion, and earlier today in one of the sessions, one of the panelists made the point that now it seems that there's consensus that people want ethical AI, and the question is now how do you do it? One of the interesting findings we had in a small study we did last year was that we looked at the top publishers at one of the major AI conferences around ethics and transparency and fairness in AI. And what we found was that somewhat surprisingly, out of all of the conference presenters, only 5% were European. Even when the conference was held in Stockholm, 85% of the authors were actually American. And so the question that arises here is we often hear the argument that Europe will be competitive in AI because of its commitment to trustworthy AI or ethics in AI. And my question is, how do the question that one of the panelists raised earlier today was, how do we actually achieve that? And will it be just through regulation? Will it be through investment in research in this area? Will it be through what the different companies are doing in this space? And so I wanted to put that question to the panel. And again, I'll just open it up to the floor. Whoever wants to take it first, we'll kind of work down the line and go from there. And I know my panelists aren't very shy, but why don't we go to Fernanda first?
Sounds good. So I have many thoughts on this. And I think it's definitely one of those things where you need a multi-pronged approach. It's not one thing it's going to solve. There's no one solution. And I think that one of the interesting things about these questions around ethical AI is that it's both there's a piece there that is a technical piece. Okay, how do we build transparency into these systems? How do we build explanation capabilities? Because these things don't come for free, right? We know that we need to work hard to design systems that can be explained, or that after the fact, if they make a prediction or something, we understand why they are making that prediction. And these things, they don't just happen out of the blue. They have to be designed and built. So there's definitely the technical question, but that doesn't solve everything by far. It doesn't solve. It's a technical question. It's also a value question, which then it's a techno-social question. So these systems, and this is one of the things that is both challenging, but also a big opportunity. Once these machine learning systems leave the labs, right? And we've done all the accuracy tests and all the performance tests and all the math is done. And when they start being deployed in the real world, then we need to take into account other considerations that become just as important as the accuracy tests, right? We definitely want our systems to be accurate, but accuracy alone is not enough. So that's when you start to have to worry and address questions around explainability, transparency, and so forth. But again, to address these questions, it's not going to be only a technical solution. It's going to be, people are going to have to come together and decide on what the values are. For instance, one of the things that is very clear when we talk about machine learning fairness, for instance, fairness varies from contexts, from country to country. What may be fair in one context may not be fair in a different context. And one of the things that as a society, we've all been very flexible around are these notions that tend to be somewhat ambiguous and very flexible, which is good. It's a good thing. Except that when you want to translate those flexible ways of thinking into math for these systems, then you need to be very specific. And again, just to use the example of machine learning fairness, there are many different metrics, mathematical metrics of fairness. And you know, even though we all want to build fair systems. That's great. But which one of those metrics are you going to choose at the end of the day? Because each one of those is a set of trade-offs that you're deciding on. And so that decision is not a technical decision. That decision is a value decision that then is going to be translated into the technical piece. And so again, this is, again, one of the challenges, because we need more stakeholders at the table to make those decisions, but also an opportunity to start having these conversations more broadly. And I really believe that, having tools that make these choices more clear and easier to understand the trade-offs you're making, is a big way. It's a big step in more stakeholders to understand the choices and make decisions together.
Yeah, if I may come in there. I don't want to repeat the previous panel, because my colleague Gabriel was already there discussing in detail all the issues in regulatory framework. I think the question of how to actually put that into practice, in the long term, it comes down to one thing, which is reputation. If you get a reputation for doing things right, then customers will accept it. Now, how exactly do you get to the reputation? I mean, my commissioner recently in a speech, he used the example of the elevator. When they invented the elevator in the 1850s, people were very afraid of it, because they thought, well, what happens if the cable goes down and everybody falls down to the brake? So this guy, Elijah Otis, in 1853, he went to the World Fair in New York. He had an elevator, and in front of 100,000 people, he cut the cables. And of course, he had a safety brake. And then, of course, nothing happened. And that's the kind of reputational image which made people say, okay, that's fine. And from then on, they started building skyscrapers. If you hadn't done that and people had been afraid of it, there wouldn't be any skyscraper. New York would be looking completely differently. So you have to create a reputation. You have to show. It's not enough that you are fair and that you are whatever. You have to actually show it to people. Now, obviously, that's going to be much easier for large companies, because they have a reputation to build on. They can, make their commitments. They can publicize the fact that they can make their commitments. They can, can do all kinds of things. And it's worth it for them, because they've got millions of customers. So investing in that is fairly straightforward. It's more complicated for small companies, small medium companies, but especially small companies. If nobody's ever heard of you, then it's difficult to use your reputation in order to instill trust in people. And that's, I think, where regulatory framework comes in. Now, the regulatory framework is always a double-edged sword. On one hand, it creates trust. On the other hand, it creates red tape. So you have to kind of balance both of them, which is also why when we published the white paper and we published our strategy 2 years ago, and every time we talk about it, we never talk about regulatory framework by itself. It's always part of a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, we really like AI, we want to promote it, etc. On the other hand, we have to put it into the right direction. I think it's going to be, eventually it's going to be a mixture of things. It's going to be a mixture of some regulation, of private efforts who maybe go beyond that regulation and set best examples, and then of many other companies who will want to imitate that.
I'd be happy to join in there as well, and hopefully not to repeat, but broad agreement with Fernanda's and Martin's statement. Definitely that it's a multi-pronged approach. I think the risk of too early, too harsh, too undifferentiated regulation would be a risk of suffocating innovation that we have. I think what we might come back later on the panel is about high risk versus low risk applications. I think that's worth going into more detail, but I won't do that now. It was the former CEO of HSBC in the FT yesterday or the day before who claimed that the algorithms that drive a lot of the e-commerce companies today, according to him, are not better understood than the complex financial products that drove us into financial crisis a decade or so ago. Now, I don't think I fully agree with that. Speaking for Booking, I would argue we are in control of the algorithms and we know what they do. But certainly, and that's the point I want to make, that a company is responsible for what they do, and whether it's human beings or algorithms that drive processes, the responsibility ultimately also the legal liability, no doubt lies with the company. And I think that links back to the point on reputation that Martin just said. And there, I think, indeed, it must be a mix of some level of regulation, voluntary commitments. To pick one example, we are working in a pilot phase with an initiative called the Swiss Digital Initiative. They are working on a digital trust label, and they're basically testing their assumptions with academia, with civil society, with regulators on our services and our products. And that's what we are very happy to do, to be part of the solution. We don't have all the answers. We're certainly not the ones to draft regulation, but doing that in dialogue, I think is very, very important to come to practical solutions.
Thanks for that. I want to come to you, Arlie, about basically on the same topic, but there's this, I think, fundamental question about, some companies are early adopters of AI and some are not, and clearly Zalando has been an early adopter. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what led to that, what enabled the company to look towards AI early on as a solution. How did it think about distinguishing itself, and how can other European companies look to your success as a model for what they could do in the future?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, in listening to previous comments of panelists, I've talked about digitalization before, so that's the obvious first step. The second is we're actually doing a lot of private research to solve our solutions. So they're actually very concrete issues. You mentioned Black Friday, but that's one of the use of AI. We use AI in our logistics centers to bundle parcels together so that the trucks leave when they're full, and that the parcels go quicker to the customer. So it's a very use of AI, which is rather simple. If I can phrase it in this way. But picking back on other. Any AI system is always complex. So my colleagues would always say, well, actually, it takes a lot of time to develop an AI case use. And it will take months. It will involve many layers of checks, the data, the input, the output, the feedback loops. So all of these steps that we regularly hear of, these are the steps which ultimately make up the black box of AI. So it's never a black box, actually. There are loads of researchers behind. And that's perhaps my comment directly to your question. It's important to build these teams. And if Europe wants to do world-class AI, as we all want it to do, this will be enabled by, let's say, the maximum of companies being able to implement AI as a tool. It's not just for the few, it should be for as many companies as possible. And for that, we need to attract the talents. So one hurdle we could try to overcome is visa restrictions. So to attract talents, you need to attract them to Europe and retain them. This can work for Zalando, but it can work for SMEs as well. No difference here. And another area which the Commission rightly identified is the networks of knowledge, so networks of innovation. This is really important. So my colleagues are part of these networks. We were also part of the high-level expert group on AI, so that's another network to discuss ethical issues. And these are really, really important. So it's building this capacity, building the university degrees will be key.
Thanks. And Peter, I'd like to go to you for that same question. What should other companies take away as the lessons that can be learned from Booking.com and what you've been able to achieve in this space, and where you also expect to go in the next few years?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, one learning, I just quickly go off AI and generally to the framework for digital businesses, where I touched upon it before, where I think for way too long, we have made it too difficult for European startups to move to the scaling phase by too much of a patchwork of regulation, whether that's in, the pre-GDPR in privacy, or still today in consumer competition issues. If we don't allow the startups that we have in many areas to use that home market of 500 million people as an asset to grow fast, and it goes back to data, by the way, to Robert's question before, to have a large enough data set to test and scale the products, then we basically bring unnecessary hurdles to allowing those assets to grow to a global scale. But that is outside of AI. Hopefully we can avoid that by starting with an EU-wide perspective on AI from the outset. And as I said in the beginning, that's the signals that we see. For sure, if we start with 27 different sets of regulation on AI across Europe, I think that would be the end of any kind of leadership of Europe in AI. But more to the core of your question, definitely one thing to share with Aurélie is a talent pipeline. We are proud at Booking to have more than 100 nationalities among our staff in Amsterdam. We have more than 5,000 people in Amsterdam. And that diversity is a huge strength also when it comes to designing AI to avoid biases. So the more diverse, the less of a risk of bias, I would argue. And yeah, when it comes to future regulation, maybe that's a moment where I can go deeper on high risk versus low risk. To give a few examples, and not to downplay Booking's leadership in AI, but it is primarily machine learning, and it's often relatively mundane applications. To give you a few ideas, we use AI for fraud detection. We use it to identify whether a new property is real or not. We use it for translations, since we operate in 43 languages. We use it for customer reviews, to bring the most relevant pieces of reviews to customers for the customer experience. So I think these are the concrete examples. And I just believe when we move to regulation, we need different levels of regulation, whether we talk about applications that bear a risk of shaping people's opinions, possibly people's voting behavior on the one hand, versus photo detection to make sure a photo is actually a kitchen and therefore an apartment, versus a hotel room, to make sure people get the right, most relevant search results.
Robert, I want to go back to you and go through this question that I think has now come up a few times. And it was the question of, what does Europe need to do to address its core deficits? And I've heard two things so far on this panel that I think has really resonated. One is that as much as we talk about AI, to our lead's point earlier, digitalization has to come first. And there's still work to be done on the digital single market. There's still work to obviously be done in terms of just improving digitalization, connectivity, all of the things that we know are important towards making services available and global and businesses scalable across Europe. And the second is this question of having data that is EU-wide. To your point earlier that Europe is doing very well in industrial data, I agree. I think that's shown in the data as well. I think the areas where Europe might struggle is in some of the public sector data where there's a commitment to making the data available, but the data doesn't actually exist in the first place in any standardized format. And an example of that would be 3D elevation data. The geospatial data that's hugely important right now to understand terrain, that can be used for research, that can be used in commercial applications. But if every country is deciding on their own exactly how they're going to collect it and how they're going to format it and how they're going to distribute it, it makes it very hard for a startup to go and create a EU-wide service. And so my question to you is, looking at some of these challenges that clearly still exist, how should we go about tackling those challenges? Because the technology continues to move very quickly.
I find that really a tough question in a way, because there would be so many answers on this question, and I think it's just not like we can turn the switch or anything and then Europe is like the perfect place for all the AI startups. I think it's really a long process in a way. And we come from a background in Europe where we build upon like our industrial backbone that kind of provided us with a huge wealth, I would say, welfare. And now we face this challenge of the digitization or digitalization that also challenges our traditional fundament of our economy a bit in a way, if we don't manage to kind of to deal with this transition phase in a way. But on the other hand, if you look at the Silicon Valley, I mean, it didn't come up like in 1 year or 2 or so. It was also quite a long process, probably over decades. And I think many really relevant steps have already been taken. I think the digitalization has arrived in the mindset of the highest politicians. So it's frequently like an issue in the European Council, for example. And I can see this also in my ministry. I'm from the Economic Affairs Ministry, and I can tell you, like a couple of years ago, then it was more called like the ICT department, was more like a niche department where no one really wanted to go because it's a kind of something for nerds and everything. And also other ministries were not really very interested in this topic, like the digitization. And now it completely changed. You can see it in our presidency. Almost all our colleagues from other areas like environment or agriculture or energy or you name it, they're all into digital, and they have this priority of basically digitizing their sector or using digital technologies for sustainability and so on. So I think there has already a lot been done, and there has been quite some development. But on the other hand, the successes, they come not from today to tomorrow. I mean, it all needs time, and I think sometimes we make like two steps forward and 1 step back. Also, I mean, if you look at some legislative initiatives of the last years, I mean, I don't want to name something in particular because it's always dangerous for a public official, but I think there are some examples where the ambitions at the beginning were different than the result in the end. And these things happen, but they happen because we are always looking for a broad consensus, and not only among citizens, but also among all the stakeholders in a way. I mean, but what do we need to do in concrete terms? You named the geospatial data. I already cited this delegated act on the high value data sets that is in the making at the moment. This is one instrument that exactly addresses this issue, that tries to define certain data sets that are held by public entity or public authorities, or in some cases also public enterprises, and try to make really conditions that allow it not only to the big tech companies like Google, for example, to make use of this data and to read this data, but also that make it accessible for companies that don't have a lot of money, don't have a lot of people, and that basically rely on standardized formats, easy access, and so on. So there are some concrete instruments, but they all take their time, because sometimes this kind of data is held by some, let's say, regional public authority that also earns some money with it. So they don't want to give up this model, which is completely understandable. And it has to be sorted out. It's like a complicated and long process, but in a way, I think we are arriving there step by step. And there are a lot of other examples, I mean, in the skills area, in the venture capital area, and so on, where there is still a lot of room for improvement. But the mindset, I would say, is basically there.
Yeah.
Thanks, Robert. I want to ask Martin if you weigh in on this as well, and maybe I can broaden the question a little bit to also ask. Right now we have many policymakers thinking about AI, and they're thinking about the future and how to move forward. And I guess my question here is, should they also be looking back in some ways? We've obviously seen a number of digital policies created in the last decade, in the last 5 years even, before AI was something that policymakers were thinking about. You can even look at the GDPR and ask, if the GDPR were being written today, where AI is top of mind, where machine learning and the importance of data are top of mind, would it look the same way? And so my question is, do we need to do any looking back as we're moving forward?
Well, I mean, first of all, the rest of policy doesn't stop because there's an AI policy now. So we didn't have an AI policy apart from research policy until 2018. There were plenty of other initiatives, and there are plenty of other things going on right now. So, for example, we're talking about infrastructures. There's 5G coming along the line. There's the high-performance computing. There are plenty of other initiatives and policies which are being promoted in parallel. So AI is only part of it, which is also why the white paper, of course, was adopted on the same day as the data strategy, because they belong together, and also as part of an overall strategy for the digital single market. For Europe Fit for the Digital Age is a new label. So it is clearly AI. I think is these days it's a very, very important element of any digital strategy, but it's just one element. There's plenty of other things to be done. GDPR, I know that some people don't particularly like it. I don't think it's as bad as some people may think it is. It has been quite widely adopted in many other countries as well, and that typically is an indication that it's not as bad as it had been predicted. I think any legislation which was adopted 2 years ago would be different today, and if you adopted it today, it would be again different in 2 years' time from now. I mean, that's the nature of legislation. Whenever you take your knowledge and your understanding of an issue at a given time and you try to make it as future-proof as possible, that's not always perfect. I certainly wouldn't say that either the GDPR or the electronic commerce legislation or any other legislation would be adopted word for word today exactly the same way as it would have done as it had been a couple of years ago. But that's not an indication that it was fundamentally wrong.
Thanks for that. Fernanda, I want to go to you on a similar vein, and you had mentioned this earlier about the role that Google has obviously played in terms of investing in research and AI and machine learning, and expanding this in Europe. And this is obviously, as I mentioned at the outset, this is one of the biggest opportunities for Europe, is to expand the commercialization of its huge research base. Can you talk a little bit about what Google's doing in this space and what you see as the opportunity?
Sure. So one of the very concrete things that Google has done is actually invest on opening new labs. And so we have now Google Research Labs in a number of places in Europe, Amsterdam, Paris, Berlin. There are others that I'm forgetting, but I'm based in London, for instance. There's a number of places and teams that are new and that already have existed before. Zurich is another place. So that's one thing, is just investing literally on the ground workforce, engaging. The other thing that's incredibly important is engaging with the academic institutions here in Europe. Because they have a different perspective than the ones in the US and the rest of the world, and because of the depth of knowledge that there is here. The other thing is just looking out at, so one of the things that, again, is this really nice multi-pronged situation is that in a place like Google, for instance, we do research that is very fundamental research. So you can even think about like theory research, but we also do very applied research also. And so we are constantly interacting with other industry players, or again, maybe academia and government, or there are a number of projects where maybe some of the libraries we're building, the very fundamental blocks of the technology, can be used for a variety of applications and different use cases. And so this is not for Google to do it, because the expertise, again, doesn't rest with us, but it is expertise that is outside of Google and that can take advantage of this kind of work. So for instance, another way in which Google interacts, and it's not Google again, it's a number of players in the industry. So we have visiting faculty programs. So for instance, in my own team, we have a visiting faculty who's an earthquake expert. And we had another writer in resident who's a philosopher. And so because, again, this technology is so malleable and it can be applied in so many different ways. I think it was interesting to hear, like, a couple of panelists already has made this point of, oh, a very humble use of, or a very modest use of technology. And that is the thing that people forget about AI, is that the media usually talks about AI as like this, oh, it's going to solve everything, it's magic. And it's like, there are amazing things that the technology is able to do today that we couldn't do before, right? But the truth is also, there are a lot of very pedestrian uses of the technology that we've been making for years now. All of us, anyone who has an email inbox makes use of AI, because guess what? You have a filter a spam filter in the back of your email. Chances are it's AI, you know, and it's doing its thing. You don't even know about it. So there are many different ways. So for instance, another thing, and again, talking about how Google interacts and shares with the rest of the world. One thing that I don't know how obvious it is, and again, this is not just Google, it's just the state of AI. I don't know how obvious this is outside of the AI academic community, but as a researcher, I can tell you that never in my career, ever before, have I seen the level of openness that exists today in AI. This is Google, every other industry player, every university, because what happens is, before, if you made a discovery or if you created the best system ever, you would stay in silence, you would write your paper, submit it to publication, wait many months for the conference, and then you would reveal it to the world. Today, you create something, you discover something, you immediately put that paper on arXiv, which is an open website. Everyone has access to it. You never wait for a conference. After you put it on arXiv and the whole world can see it, then you submit to a conference and you hope that you have a peer-reviewed publication. But why are people doing this? Because things are moving so fast that people don't want to be scooped. They don't want to wait. And so what this means is that it forces the whole field to move much, much faster than it would otherwise, and in a completely transparent way, because your researchers, you're not going to wait again. And so, for instance, for a place like Google, the number of models that we have open sourced, the number of data sets that we have open sourced is incredible. And it touches everything. It's videos, it's language, it's translation, it's images, you name it. And so even though I know that, you know, there is the big company and the small startup or the universities, and these are different communities with access to different things, the level of openness is astounding, and it's a new thing. It has never, we haven't been here before. And as a researcher, I'm really excited because it means I can, so for instance, 95% of what my team at Google creates is open sourced with the rest of the world. And mind you, these are tools that we use for Google, at Google internally, for our products that we share with the world. Because they are so useful. Another thing that I think is super important, and it's not just Google, this is happening across the industry, is if you come up with a set of processes around questions, thorny questions around things like ethical AI or explainability for end users or so, one of the things we've been doing at Google is to try to formalize these processes and share them. So for instance, my team created this guidebook called the PAIR Guidebook with very concrete guidelines for things like explainability to your end user. When you don't even understand everything your system is doing, how do you explain to an end user? How do you deal with fairness? A number of things. And so again, this is something, these are processes and guidelines we use at Google that we're sharing with the rest of the world, also because we want to learn. What works for the rest of the world? What should we improve on? And so forth. So I think this dialogue, this much more open dialogue that exists today between, say, industry players, academia, government, is new, and it is incredibly exciting because, again, I think the openness helps us all.
That's a great point. And Robert, did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, hopefully it doesn't only help the big ones like Google. So now I have a question actually to Fernanda, but also the other industry representatives, Aurelie and Peter. Fernanda, you mentioned basically that in the labs you would look for accuracy mainly, and then afterwards you would see how you can deal with the fairness and so on. So I was wondering if this fairness, or let's say in more general terms, the ethical AI approach, isn't it already, or shouldn't it already be part of the design process? And isn't that one of the goals that we basically are aiming for, that this ethical AI is already kind of there from the first moment on, and then it's probably also much easier for companies to deal with it. And that's my first question. The other question is that did this discussion that is now already going on for some years, I would say, around the ethical AI, did it already change kind of how you look at these design processes on AI? At Zalando, for example, did you basically change your processes and discuss these issues like at a much earlier stage or something like that? I would be interested.
Yeah, no, both great questions. So let me contextualize my answer before. What I meant in the, when it's in the lab and then it leaves the lab, what I meant is more a historical view of what happened with AI. Historically speaking, because AI comes from computer science, mainly from computer science departments, historically speaking, what these researchers were doing were to aim to make the accuracy level of their systems higher. So in other words, their systems would get more and more of the right answers, right? The performance. And that tends to be a mathematical measure. So if I have an image classification system and I train it and then I test it, and my image classification system does like 95% positive, it gets 95% of the positive of the right answers. I'm like, oh, It's really accurate. That's great. Okay, that's the mathematical piece of it. Now, it could be that as you start looking more into what the mistakes are that your system is making, that maybe most of the mistakes are about a certain demographic group of the population or something. And so that's a problem, right? That is not okay. Those 5% mistakes are not okay. So again, going back to history, these systems were just being done in labs, in universities, in a computer science domain, and they become very accurate. Once they make the transition from labs, and this is not only academia, this is also like industry labs sometimes. Once they start to make the transition between like just little prototypes in a lab to products that affect society, then the considerations started to change. And this is the new phase we're in, which is the systems now are affecting society at many different levels. And so there are a number of considerations. And to your point, yes, you need to be thinking about these considerations and ethical AI considerations from the beginning. So to answer maybe a little bit of both questions at the same time, yes, at Google, we start thinking about these considerations from the beginning of the design of these systems. And yes, these considerations have changed the way we do things at Google. And so now, for instance, one of the changes is that for years now, we have a process, an ethical AI process at Google. And so things like, oh, what does that mean? Well, it means things like, as a researcher, let's say I create a new system, it does something nobody could do before, and I want to publish about it. I have to undergo a review system. That has always been true at Google before I can publish. But now one layer of that review is the ethical review. That now, you know, does your system have anything to say about fairness? Does it touch any of the questions around fairness? Have you thought about bias? And if so, how? Have you mitigated for bias or not? Or are you talking about it? How do you address all these questions that you should be thinking about as a researcher? The same thing with products. There is always a review, a set of reviews that has always been true at Google. And now we have an AI and ethical review as well. It's been going on for years. And as a result of these processes, now we have a couple more things. We have precedent. So for instance, if there is a project that goes through that review, I can give you a concrete example. So
Fernanda, I don't want to cut you off, but I do want to make sure that RLA and Peter have a chance to respond. And I also know we have a few audience questions coming in. So I want to give the audience a chance to get their questions in. So I didn't want to interrupt you, but I just wanted to ask you if you could maybe...
Yes. So just, yeah. I won't go into the concrete example, but just to say concretely, certain open sourcing launches have been stopped. And decisions have been made about whether or not to approve use of the technology in different products. And these decisions then become precedent for other following reviews. So there's definitely a set of very concrete steps that happen. And yes, change has happened for sure.
Thanks so much for that. I think it's really interesting because it's hard on the outside to sometimes see the bad things that don't happen, right? When ethical reviews are in place, you don't see those things. And so it's good to hear about that. RLA.
Yeah, I'll jump in. On your question, Robert, definitely we were part of these discussions early on because one of our experts was in the high-level expert group of the European Commission. So it started quite a long time ago, I think at least 2.5 years ago. And these discussions are happening But we'd like to think about it as not just discussions. We actually call it excellence in AI. So the way of doing AI should be excellent, and this describes some of the processes that Fernanda outlined. This definitely goes with me as well, where you just control all the steps of developing an AI case use. And as I said, it takes months, so it's literally many steps. And positively, the Commission went into this topic early on. So, for example, we now have a list of about 60 questions that you can ask yourself when you develop AI. So we run these questions on one of our AI case use in the pilot phase some months ago. And we also actually quickly realized that these questions are answered very differently within the same company, depending on which AI case use you're looking at. So some of these case use may be extremely low risk. So you can very fairly easily say from the onstart, okay, yes, we thought about privacy, yes, we thought about fairness, we've looked at biases. So you can do that early on. There may be AI case use where it's actually harder. And back to a point which Peter made earlier, this low risk, high risk approach is something we really support. So the EU is rightly looking at these questions. We should answer them. Looking towards the future, I hope that the success factor of the AI regulations that we expect are going to be that as many companies as possible can use AI, and that when it's low risk, you cross-check basic points. Have you done AI according to the excellence way that we should follow? And when it's higher risk, maybe be subject to more checks, more limitations.
Thank you. Peter, I want to bring you in on this as well.
Not very much to add, but technology evolves, and so does societal debate and regulation. Often regulation, following. But for sure, the ongoing discussion is shaping, how we talk about AI in the company and how we develop AI. And I would definitely agree with you that there needs to be a kind of ethics by design principle, like we have a privacy by design, but that has also evolved, right? There's a regulatory framework. And for sure, if, again, hopefully no one is offended, but if we let engineers in isolation and without connections to the outside world optimize algorithms, for sure, that bears a risk in principle that this wouldn't be in compliance or in respect of either regulation or societal rules. So this is an evolving process, I would argue. And if I may, Daniel, very briefly coming back to a previous question that was around the kind of success factors and the environment to make AI prosper in Europe. I said a while ago that we have more than 100 nationalities working at our headquarters, and that's fantastic. But part of the truth is also that we don't have the pipeline of European candidates to fill all these roles. Now, we are obviously open and happy to hire people from all over the world, but the reality is that for specific high-end AI roles, the pipeline just is not sufficient in Europe alone. And that, I think, goes back to STEM education from kindergarten to university, and to a shift in mindset, which is happening, but which takes time. And if I may, very briefly, second point on mindset, and that is maybe a subtle sight into the parallel ongoing discussion about platform regulation. I think it's also important that we don't have a mindset in Europe that big is bad. Big isn't bad. What's bad is if you abuse a dominant or a powerful situation, if you have anti-competitive behavior, especially in markets that are not contestable or have very high barriers to entry. But in some of the discussions, and I'll close there, I still sometimes feel that feeling of big is bad. And with this attitude, I think we will not allow European players to grow to that global scale that ultimately I think we need to have if we want Europe to be a player also on the regulatory front. So we need the startups, but we also need the big players that can be the lighthouses, if you want, in an ecosystem to also attract talent, maybe back from Silicon Valley back into Europe.
Thanks so much for that. We have about 5 minutes left, and I want to try and get in 2 more questions. One to Fernanda. You do so much really interesting research around data visualizations and human-centered AI, and I just want you to maybe talk a little bit about the value of that research, because I think when we talk about technology, especially AI, we know that people fear things they don't understand. And we know that public support for technology is hugely important in adoption. And so I think the data visualizations, for example, are so important for people to understand how a system works, for understanding what data consists of, for getting meaning. So I just wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about some of the research you're doing in that space and how you see that intersecting with these broader questions and the impact it'll have on the policy debate.
Sure, and I'll try to be very brief. So data visualization turns out to be kind of a secret weapon in opening up a lot of the hard concepts of AI to a much broader audience. So things that we've been doing, for instance, is what we call AI explorables, which are online little interactive visualizations and simulations just to explain to people things like, again, fairness trade-offs, or like federated learning, which is one way to do privacy with AI. And these complex mathematical concepts, but if you use visualization, it turns out people can understand so much more because we are so good with understanding visual patterns. So we've used them, data visualization, for education. We've also used them for literally looking inside these machine learning systems and understanding how they're behaving. And this is some of the more like ML expert work we do. And then interestingly, I think is for a discussion like this, even end user transparency through data visualization turns out to be super powerful. So for instance, there are a number of teams at Google that use data visualization to explain their machine learning behavior to end users, like Google Maps, Google Flights. And it's amazing. You can definitely see in user studies how much more data people can digest super easily if you present it in a way that is friendly to them. But that doesn't take away the complexity. It's just easier to understand. And so the last thing I want to say about that is, by allowing that kind of transparency through data visualization, it really empowers the end user to calibrate the right level of confidence they should have or shouldn't have in an AI system that they are, in an app that is AI enabled, for instance, that they are using. So I'm a big proponent of that.
Thank you. Robert, I want to give you the last word and the last question. And it's really just, as we're looking forward into the next year, what should the EU be thinking about in terms of advancing competitiveness in AI? And to what extent should the deadlines for priorities be shaped by what other countries are doing in this space, including China?
Maybe I would refer to one thing that we didn't really mention during the debate. It's what we have now on the table with our new financial framework and the recovery facility. I mean, even terrible things as the COVID pandemic have like some aspects that contain, let's say, opportunities. And I think this resilience and recovery facility is really one of these opportunities, and that we should really try to use also to bring forward AI. I mean, digitization is one of the key priorities, or should be one of the key priorities in that facility. And it's, I mean, these funds that are now there to let's say restart our economy, they're basically they're a unique opportunity that we have now, and that can bring us on a new level in some aspects. That's at least my hope. But we have to make use of it, and it shouldn't like go into things where it's just like wasted in a way. But yeah, we are working on that, I would say, and yeah, I'm optimistic, I have to say.
Well, thank you, and thanks to all of our panelists today. That concludes our session. Next on the agenda is our second break. During the break, there are a number of options that we have available for you as well. We have a roundtable discussion on AI in the legal and regulatory landscape. This is a fully interactive roundtable limited to the first 20 people who get there. So you can come on video and actually have a conversation with other participants. We also have our one-on-one networking. If you click on the network tab on the left sidebar. And then, of course, we have a number of very interesting vendors in the expo, which you should definitely check out. And then we'll be reconvening for the next plenary session at 3:30 p.m. So thanks again, and thanks to our panelists.
Thank you so much.